I'm sure at some point you've all been walking down the street and see somebody wearing a frayed old flannel shirt or dirty cardigan with ripped tattered jeans, poorly bleached hair,
You can't keep getting away with it!
scuffed old Converse shoes, and extremely suspect sunglasses. That individual is one of two things: either they are homeless or subscribe to grunge fashion. Despite the fact the grunge scene in Seattle was extremely short-lived and very quickly subjected to commercialization and oversaturation due to its popularity,
All of a sudden I'm thirsty.
Give me a Bud Light.
the style of the scene has definitely made an impact on fashion today and what many people see as socially acceptable to wear, whether that be due to its inherent visual appeal or the fact that so many people thirst over the extremely attractive and widely appealing Kurt Cobain. It's still become a mainstay within contemporary clothing that directly links to the music and culture of the time. So why is this? Why are so many people comfortable or even proud to pay hundreds of shekels to look homeless whilst listening to atrociously mastered Kurt Cobain demo tapes on £300 perfectly EQ'd mixing headphones? Due to the fact the grunge scene lasted under half a decade and didn't have much development within that time, the fashion of the scene hasn't changed that much. Unlike punk or goth that has had multiple different incarnations throughout music history, therefore a different style attached to each distinct subgenre, the fashion of grunge has always been commonly considered to be pretty similar visually by most people. This means I can easily describe the clothes and fashion of the scene without having to dip into the development due to different subgenres and scenes. Grunge fashion essentially encompasses just normal clothing, with there being key emphasis on lack of performative elements within the dress. By this I mean early grunge artists looked like they just rolled out of bed, picked up whatever crusty item of clothing they had dumped on the floor, and attempted to layer it on their body without gagging from the old cigarette stench. You may be thinking, how does this style just differ from the average person? Well, it doesn't really, apart from the fact that grunge aficionados will size everything up so much that the clothes would fit a small gorilla, and of course they look like they've been dragged through a muddy field full of extremely sharp blades of grass. But what clothes do they actually wear? Well, it's mainly items you would find at a second-hand or thrift shop, commonly consisting of flannel shirts, knitted jumpers that are hanging on by a single thread, oversized t-shirts, tattered faded jeans and old boots. This style is also completely androgynous, with much of the clothing actually being pretty feminine in some cases, although lacking the elements that emphasize feminine curves or features. Women within the scene saw this as a way to push forward the music, making a statement on how they are not controlled by their sex appeal, which had become a common trait in the past decades, not just for women though, although nobody wants to see this Motley Crue wearing this. So how did essentially normal clothing become a fashion statement inherently linked to culture and music that's still thriving today? In order to find that out, we need to briefly explore the beginning of the Seattle grunge scene and how the culture of the time as well as trends of the past led to this style of dress. Grunge was primarily a counterculture genre. Well, before it proved it could make a lot of money, then you literally couldn't avoid it within culture, but I digress. In a way, grunge was born out of the decline of hair metal and punk, and due to the fact that anything that is slightly inspired by punk has to rebel against whatever was before it, grunge's fashion was more so subdued and low effort than the complete clusterfuck that was punk anti-fashion or hair metal fashion beforehand. To simplify this, punks wore the stupidest shit possible to rebel against people wearing regular old button-up shirts, and individuals within the grunge scene just wore the button-up shirt to rebel against whatever the punks were doing. Grunge fashion didn't just look upon punks of the past when deciding what to differ from. The decade prior saw the explosion of hair metal, which saw some of the most outlandish, performative outfits in the history of music. Hair metal differed from early punks, however, as it wasn't organic in the slightest. Much of the appeal of hair metal was the visual style: be as bold and eye-catching as possible and hope people ignore the atrocious music. Many of grunge's pioneers despised the mainstream hair metal of the time, seeing it as a manufactured image to make as much delicious profit as possible. This pushed early grunge artists to not only make music that appealed to only them, but dress completely authentically to avoid glamorizing themselves in any way. The clothing also had a lot to do with the location of the grunge explosion, Seattle, which had such atrocious weather that many bands pre-grunge would completely avoid playing shows there. This weather encouraged clothing that emphasized comfort and reliability. So that explains the prior cultural rumblings and geography that led to the development of this style of clothing. What actually happened when grunge exploded in popularity? Spoiler alert, Kurt Cobain quickly became a fashion icon. The release of Nevermind by Nirvana in 1991 truly saw a grunge explosion, with many other bands in the scene being signed to major labels and seeing serious airplay. all donning a similar dress that was pretty standard for the Seattle underground prior to grunge's huge popularity, and of course, less than a year after Nevermind's release, plaid shirts, layering, baggy silhouettes, and an overall thrifted look was seeing regular catwalk usage with brands like Calvin Klein and Perry Ellis, Marc Jacobs. Cobain and contemporaries had made it cool to look disheveled and unwashed, completely countering the flashy over-the-top style of beforehand. Before you could even seductively utter Cobain's name, clothing was sold in almost every fashion retailer in the West with the tagline grunge. Much like punk, goth and metal beforehand, suddenly the anti-conformist grunge clothing was mainstream and encouraged by retailers in order to make as much money as possible. Unfortunately, the death of Cobain in 1994 led to a decline in not only the popularity of grunge music within the mainstream, but much of what was attached to it, including the clothing. This may raise a question. How strongly was the popularity of grunge fashion linked to Kurt Cobain? Well, quite a lot and not so much at the same time in my opinion. Obviously, the huge appeal of grunge fashion within the mainstream was very heavily linked to Cobain. He very quickly became a cultural icon in the mainstream for his look, personality and outlook. The media pushed him to the forefront of everything trendy, meaning he was bound to inspire countless individuals when it comes to personal style. And although it's hard to deny that the insane cultural relevance of Cobain has a lot to do with the style's mainstaying power, I feel it's likely it would have become popular in some sense with or without Cobain. Like literally all you need to do is actually wear your clothes for an extended period of time and you get grunge clothing. Despite the dip in popularity in all things grunge within the mainstream, the clothing is incredibly universally appealing, meaning it has remained a mainstay within fashion. If you were to look to many of the other music-based fashion cultures, for example punk, goth and emo, a lot of it is either incredibly outlandish or suits a certain time and place, becoming dated until the trend cycle rolls back around again. Don't get me wrong, aspects of these styles are still used within regular day-to-day fashion, as well as high-end runway bollocks, but it's rare you'll find an outfit that is almost identical to how it was back in the time period of its original boom, and it's even more rare that it will actually look good. This isn't the case for grunge. It's very likely you'll see many individuals rocking the style without even being aware of Mudhoney or Melvins. I believe this is because the style of grunge actually stemmed from a style of dress that was in circulation amongst non-musicians before the music became popular, and more importantly actually fit for weather or purpose, unlike half the UK punks were wearing in the late
70s.
Like bruv, we have rain here. We have hail sometimes, the weather is not good. Put on a raincoat, what is this metal, what is this?